At age 49, Tim Duncan is remembered as one of the greatest and most enduring icons in NBA history, a man who built his entire career not with flashy spotlight, but with the cold perfection of discipline and efficiency. 5 NBA championships spread across 3 different decades, 2 regular season MVP awards, 3 Finals MVP awards, 15 All-Star selections, 15 appearances on the All-Defensive First Team, more than 26,000 points scored, thousands of rebounds and blocks. Those numbers aren't just statistics, they're proof of a silent dominance that never needed to show off. Over 19 seasons wearing the San Antonio Spurs jersey, he never left the team, never demanded special treatment, never put his ego above the collective, becoming the cornerstone of one of the rare dynasties in modern American sports. Tim Duncan was inducted into the Hall of Fame, universally recognized by experts as the greatest power forward of all time, the foundation that turned a small-market team into a symbol of sustained winning and a culture of discipline. But when the titles have been neatly filed away in the memory of history, when the cheers have faded into the past, what remains on an early morning in San Antonio is not complete pride, but the quiet, lingering pain of a body worn down over 2 decades and a soul that never had time to rest. Degenerated knees, a lower back that aches with every movement, long nights without sleep, because the body no longer obeys. Those are the costs he never publicly complained about. At the same time, there's another, quieter pain, the emptiness of a man who lived his entire life for others, for the system, for the team, to the point that when everything stopped, he had to relearn how to exist for himself. Tim Duncan didn't collapse under that void. He clenched his jaw, accepted the pain just as he once accepted every sacrificed role on the court, because his will was never about being loved or remembered. It was about never betraying who he was. In that silence, he continued to stand tall, refusing to let the pain turn him bitter, refusing to let loneliness erode his dignity. Because if he learned one thing in his entire life, it was this: some people don't live to be applauded. They live to fulfill their responsibility until the very last moment, even if the price is a loneliness that stretches across the rest of their days. If you've ever admired the quiet greatness of Tim Duncan and want to understand the story behind those victories, please hit subscribe to keep joining us on this journey. When Tim Duncan stood in front of his mother's casket at age 14, he wasn't old enough to fully grasp the meaning of death, but he was sensitive enough to feel that a part of his world had just collapsed and would never be rebuilt the same way again. The room that day wasn't loud, wasn't cinematic tragedy. There was only the suffocating smell of funeral flowers, pale light, and the motionless face of the woman who had been the spiritual center of his life. His mother died of cancer, an illness that had quietly drained her strength for a long time, and when death finally came, it gave Tim Duncan no final warning he could prepare for. It wasn't a moment of violent tears. It was a shock that froze every emotion. Tim stood there, arms hanging limp, eyes fixed on the casket lid, and for the first time in his life, he learned a brutal lesson. Some pain doesn't allow you to cry, because if you cry, you will completely fall apart. No one put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're allowed to cry." No one taught him how to face loss. No one showed him how to grieve without shame. In that moment, Tim Duncan didn't choose to wail. He chose silence. And that choice, which seemed like nothing more than the reflex of a confused child, became the survival instinct he carried for the rest of his life. His mother wasn't just the person who gave him life. She was the only one in the family who consistently made Tim feel truly seen, not with grand words, but with quiet, unwavering presence. When she left, the void wasn't just sadness. It was a deep hole in the way Tim understood love, comfort, and the right to be vulnerable. After the funeral, life went on as if nothing had changed. School stayed open, practices continued, adults stayed busy with their jobs, and Tim learned that the world doesn't stop for one boy's pain. In that cold continuation, he began swallowing his tears, little by little, until not crying became more natural than crying. He didn't talk about his mother, didn't ask why she had to die, didn't allow himself to wonder if it was fair, because no one around him seemed ready to listen. Silence became his armor, the only way he wouldn't be swallowed by the pain. Years later, when he was grown, people would admire Tim Duncan for his rare calmness, for his ability to stay composed under enormous pressure. But very few understood that calmness wasn't natural. It was forged in a child, forced to grow up too soon, in front of his mother's coffin. From that moment at the casket, Tim Duncan learned to carry his emotions alone, never sharing, never leaning on anyone, never expecting comfort from the outside. He grew up with the quiet belief that if he was strong enough, disciplined enough, silent enough, pain couldn't bring him down. But the bitter truth is that pain doesn't disappear. It just sinks deeper, quietly shaping the person from the inside. In the years that followed, every time Tim faced failure, injury, or the crushing weight of expectation, he didn't panic, didn't complain, because he had already stood before something far worse and survived. Yet, the price of that survival was that Tim never learned how to heal. The pain of losing his mother was never processed, never named, never put in its proper place. It was locked away inside him, silently influencing every relationship, every way he responded to the world. While others turned to friends, family, or words of comfort, Tim Duncan turned to discipline. While others released through tears, he released by forcing himself to endure more. That's why, later on, even after reaching heights millions only dream of, Tim never felt completely whole because the most important part of him had been frozen at age 14, standing silently in front of his mother's coffin, learning not to cry so he could keep living. His mother's death didn't make Tim Duncan weak. It made him extraordinarily strong in the coldest, most solitary way possible, a strength that came without comfort, without emotional release. And from that moment, until this very day, through all the glory, titles, and reverence of an entire sport, one truth has never changed. Tim Duncan has never truly healed since the day that 14-year-old boy first learned to swallow his tears. After his mother's death, Tim Duncan didn't have time to sink into grief, because even before he could fully understand what he had just lost, he clung to something else, like a final life raft, to keep from being swept away: swimming. Before basketball entered Tim's life, water was the place where he felt safe, the rare space where his body could move while his mind stayed quiet. In the salty waters of the Virgin Islands, Tim didn't have to speak, didn't have to explain, didn't have to face pitying looks or expectations. There was only breathing, strokes, and the feeling of moving forward little by little. The Olympic dream wasn't some vain child's ambition. It was a very specific, very disciplined dream, built day by day through sweat and repetition, as if by swimming long enough and hard enough, he could leave the pain behind him. For Tim, swimming wasn't just a sport. It was a refuge, the only way to feel he still had control over something in a world that had just lost his mother and become terrifyingly fragile. But then, just like his mother's death came without warning, Hurricane Hugo in 1989 swept through the Caribbean and destroyed everything Tim had been holding on to. The only Olympic-sized pool back home was devastated. Murky seawater flooded in, facilities turned to rubble, and with it, Tim's Olympic dream shattered in silence. There was no farewell ceremony, no words of comfort, no one stepping up to say he'd be okay, just the stark reality that the path he had walked, believed in, and pinned his entire future on had suddenly vanished after one storm. This was the first loss outside of family, but for Tim, it was no smaller than his mother's death, because it reinforced a cold realization that was slowly forming inside him. The things you love most can be taken away at any moment, with no reason, no fairness, Those two blows, losing his mother and losing his dream, happened before Tim had a chance to fully grow up, before he learned to distinguish between hope and illusion, and they etched a lasting sense of insecurity deep into his mind. He didn't get angry, didn't blame nature or fate, because he was already too accustomed to not asking questions. Instead, Tim learned to adapt by retreating inward, telling himself that if he didn't cling tightly to anything, then when it disappeared, it would hurt less. But that very defense mechanism also made him guarded with emotions, with dreams, and with the belief that anything could last for long. When the pool was gone, Tim no longer had a place to escape the memories of his mother, the house full of emptiness, the heavy silence that enveloped his teenage years. He was forced to find another path, not out of burning passion, but because if he didn't keep moving forward, the losses would swallow him whole. It was in that context that basketball appeared not as a new dream, but as a reluctant solution, a door that opened when every other door had slammed shut. But unlike swimming, where Tim once believed effort would lead to clear rewards, basketball came to him amid doubt and caution. He no longer dared to dream big, no longer dared to put his whole heart into one single path, because 2 consecutive losses had taught him that loving too much meant losing even more. Instead of dreaming of medals, Tim began to dream smaller, dreaming only of surviving, of not being left behind. The feeling that everything he loved could disappear didn't make him pessimistic in a loud way. It made him cautious to the point of coldness, always keeping a safe distance from joy and hope. Many years later, when people saw Tim Duncan on the court with an almost emotionless calm, few knew that behind that calm was a child who had learned one of life's cruelest lessons far too early. Don't ever believe too much that anything is permanent. The Olympic dream swallowed by the sea didn't just end one athletic path. It ended the last remnants of Tim Duncan's innocence, forcing him to step into adulthood, carrying a belief that both helped him survive and left him with a quiet, lingering fear that anything beautiful, if loved deeply enough, could be taken away in an instant. When basketball entered Tim Duncan's life, it didn't come as a promise, much less as a saving light after consecutive losses. It was more like a narrow path that opened up when there were no other choices left. Tim started playing basketball later than most other kids, late enough that he had no childhood memories tied to the sound of a ball bouncing on the floor, or dreams of the NBA nurtured from an early age. While those around him were already comfortable dribbling, shooting, reading the game on instinct, Tim was still fumbling with the basics, clumsy enough to be easily overlooked. His body was tall and big, but he didn't yet understand how to operate it in the tight space of the court. His hands were long, but not yet refined enough to turn movement into points. No one waited for him to improve. No one set aside special time to teach him, because in the world of sports, patience is usually reserved only for early blooming talents. Tim Duncan wasn't a prodigy being chased after, wasn't a name that made coaches do a double take, and certainly wasn't the center of any spotlight. He was just a tall, quiet kid who showed up late, carrying a hard-to-name wariness, as if he still wasn't fully convinced this path would last. Those first practices passed in a feeling of being out of place, where Tim realized that the physical pain of training was nothing compared to the feeling of being dismissed, judged as slow, lacking instinct, lacking what people call natural talent. But after everything he had already lost, Tim was no stranger to being overlooked. He was used to not being favored, not being comforted, and he no longer expected it. Instead of fighting back or complaining, he chose the only way he knew: endure. Every wrong move, he repeated it. Every time he was knocked down, he got back up. Every doubtful look from others only made him quieter, more focused, as if by not drawing attention, at least he wouldn't be cut right away. Tim Duncan learned basketball not through inspiration, but through tedious repetition, through accepting that he would never be the fastest, the most skillful, or the most liked. He learned to use his height not as a born advantage, but as a tool that needed sharpening every single day. He learned to stand in the right position, move less but more efficiently, do the simple things with precision that couldn't be ignored. There were no cheers, no explosive moments that made others gasp in awe, only long practices, and the heavy fatigue pressing down on the shoulders of a boy already too familiar with carrying burdens. It was during this period that Tim learned a bitter but life-defining lesson. If you want to survive, don't wait for anyone to clear the path for you. No one here was waiting for him to grow up. No one was ready to bet on someone who arrived late with his own dream. To survive, he had to endure on his own, push forward on his own, accept that the road ahead would never be rolled out with a red carpet. Basketball, just like the life Tim had lived since he was very young, made no promises of fairness. It only allowed those stubborn enough to stay. And in that stubbornness, Tim Duncan gradually formed a strange relationship with pain, not avoiding it, not resisting it, but accepting it as an inevitable part of the process of existing. He didn't play to be loved, didn't play to be applauded. He played because it was the only way not to be left behind, the only way to prove to himself that after losing his mother, losing his Olympic dream, he could still stand firm in the face of a new challenge. Those late-coming basketball years didn't bring early glory, but they etched into Tim a cold and enduring philosophy of life. Don't wait for the spotlight, because the spotlight isn't for those who come late. Learn to survive in the shadows, because it's there, if you're patient enough, that you can build a kind of strength no one sees, but no one can take away. When Tim Duncan stepped onto the draft podium as the #1 pick, the moment that should have been the start of a sports fairy tale was instead filled with a quiet acceptance rather than excitement, as if this was just the next stop on a familiar journey of endurance. San Antonio wasn't New York, wasn't Los Angeles, wasn't a place where the lights were already waiting to embrace a young talent. It was a small, quiet, insular market where people respected work more than words, discipline more than emotion. The San Antonio Spurs welcomed Tim Duncan not with warm, open arms, but with a cold, precise system where every mistake was remembered and every contribution was treated as duty. There was no space for emotional outbursts, no room for healing stories, only packed practice schedules, strict rules, and an ironclad belief that if you did the right thing every single day, the team would endure. Tim blended into that culture with frightening speed, not because he found it comfortable, but because it felt familiar, a place that didn't ask about feelings, didn't pause to comfort, didn't promise anything beyond the continuation of responsibility. San Antonio was cold in its own way, not the cold of hostility, but the cold of organized indifference, where you were respected if you performed well and overlooked if you fell out of step. For Tim Duncan, this wasn't a shock. It was a repeat of his childhood, an environment where you weren't coddled, only expected. The long practices, the first games passed in silence, no media frenzy, no rookie star label to shield him. He learned to survive in the Spurs by becoming so reliable he was irreplaceable, accepting that affection wasn't something this team provided. The Spurs didn't rescue Tim from his old wounds, didn't teach him how to open up or share pain. They simply gave him a structure solid enough to let him keep enduring longer, working harder, carrying more. In that system, Tim Duncan gradually became the cornerstone, not because he was the most loved, but because he never demanded anything for himself. He didn't ask for the spotlight, didn't need praise, didn't seek attention. He just quietly met every demand, as if doing enough, well enough, long enough, would somehow close the inner void on its own. But it didn't close. Every small victory only made it clearer that the Spurs were a home that didn't embrace. It gave you discipline, gave you purpose, gave you a reason to wake up each morning, but it didn't give you unconditional love. Tim Duncan accepted that, even leaned into it, because he had long been accustomed to living in such spaces. In San Antonio, he didn't have to learn how to endure. He just had to extend it. And in that process, he slowly came to understand a painful paradox. This very cold environment would make him great, but it would also ensure that his greatness always came with loneliness. The Spurs didn't embrace Tim Duncan, but they gave him a place to set his pain down every day, to turn it into work, into wins, into stability that stretched across the years. In return, he gave them absolute loyalty, as if that was the only way to justify everything he had endured since he was a boy. In that unembracing home, Tim Duncan wasn't saved. He was simply allowed to stay, and he stayed long enough for the pain to become part of his identity. Quiet, enduring, and never named. 1999 came to Tim Duncan faster than his mind could prepare for, as if life decided to hand him a championship before he even figured out where he was heading. In just his second NBA season, the trophy was in the hands of the San Antonio Spurs, and by the usual logic of American sports, that should have been the moment that kicked off pure, unfiltered happiness. A #1 pick, a small city hungry for a title, a dynasty just beginning to bloom. But for Tim Duncan, that feeling didn't last as long as people might think. The trophy arrived too quickly, the cheers rang out too soon, and amid the crowd's excitement, he stood there with a hard-to-name sensation, not quite sadness, not quite complete joy, but a vague emptiness that refused to be filled. He played brilliantly, shouldered a role bigger than his years, became the center of the team at a time when the NBA hadn't even fully grasped who he was yet. And that very fact gave the victory a strange shade. It felt more like a mission accomplished than a dream finally reached. When the champagne bottles popped in the locker room, when teammates hugged amid laughter, Tim Duncan smiled politely, appropriately, but deep down he recognized a truth that unsettled him. The emptiness didn't disappear with the trophy. He had once believed, even if he never said it out loud, that winning might bring something like compensation, that if he did well enough, reached high enough, then the past losses, his mother's death, the Olympic dream, swallowed by the sea. The years of solitude would be soothed. But standing on that first peak, Tim Duncan understood that victory had no power to heal. It didn't bring his mother back, didn't restore the innocence he'd lost, didn't teach him how to feel whole. It only confirmed that he had fulfilled his role, that he was good enough to meet the demands of a cold system, and that was it. The realization came quietly, but it sank in deep enough to stay. In the days after the celebration, as the city returned to its everyday rhythm, Tim Duncan returned to his familiar routine: training, maintaining discipline, keeping emotions firmly under control. But this time, something was different. He no longer believed victory was the final destination. It was just a stop along the way, and if he clung to it as his only source of meaning, he would soon find himself emptier than ever. The irony was that the 1999 championship didn't lighten Tim Duncan's load. It placed a new, heavier responsibility on his shoulders. The expectation that he would keep bringing home more trophies, that he would become the foundation of a dynasty. While his younger teammates could savor the pure joy of a first title, Tim Duncan began to feel locked into a role with no clear way out. He wasn't allowed to relax, wasn't allowed to stray, wasn't allowed to show fatigue, because this team had placed its faith in his steadiness. And in that very steadiness, the quiet emptiness grew. Tim Duncan didn't talk about it, didn't share it with anyone, because he was already far too accustomed to keeping everything inside. He kept playing with the same calm demeanor, kept meeting every demand, kept serving as the model of perfect discipline, while inside he was learning a hard lesson. Some victories only make clearer what you've already lost, rather than compensating for it. That first championship, from the outside, looked like the early peak of a great career. From the inside, it was the moment Tim Duncan first confronted the truth that life doesn't operate on fair logic. You can do everything right, achieve what millions only dream of, and still carry a nameless emptiness, because the deepest losses lie beyond the reach of any victory. And from 1999 onward, Tim Duncan entered the next phase of his career, no longer holding the naive belief that success would save him, but with a colder resolve. If victory couldn't fill the void, then at least he would use it to keep surviving, keep shouldering the burden, and keep moving forward even as the road grew heavier and more solitary. After the 1999 championship, Tim Duncan was no longer a young player learning how to survive in the Spurs system. He became the emotional axis of the entire team, a position no one officially assigned him with words, but everyone silently understood he had to stand there. Becoming the emotional cornerstone didn't mean he was allowed to be vulnerable. On the contrary, it was a quiet sentence that from now on, every personal emotion had to be carefully hidden. Tim Duncan understood this very early, because he was already accustomed to carrying heavy burdens. From his mother's death, from dreams taken away, from a victory that brought no relief. Now that burden was placed on his shoulders in a different, harsher form, the responsibility of leadership. No one told him he wasn't allowed to be sad, but in that locker room, sadness was a luxury. It slowed the pace of practice, shook the stability, and the Spurs existed on absolute stability. So Tim Duncan learned to compress every emotion, keep his voice steady, his eyes calm. Even when inside, he sometimes just wanted to disappear from every gaze. He wasn't allowed to collapse, because if he collapsed, the whole system would waver. In the following seasons, as the pressure mounted, as expectations from fans and coaches grew heavier each year, Tim Duncan didn't try to escape. He accepted it as an inevitable part of the role. He became the first to arrive at the gym and the last to leave, not to prove anything, but to make sure no one had to worry about his presence. But that very endurance was also a form of self-inflicted harm, because it didn't allow him to stop and ask himself how he was really feeling. The painful failures, the playoff losses, the moments that should have been released through emotion, all were swallowed by Tim Duncan in silence, as if by not naming the pain, it wouldn't exist. But the pain didn't disappear. It only accumulated, settled, became an invisible pressure bearing down on every movement, every decision. In the eyes of his teammates, Tim Duncan was the embodiment of steadiness. No panic, no complaints, no blame. But few knew that to maintain that steadiness, he had to constantly deny himself the right to be vulnerable, the right to admit that some days he wasn't okay. He didn't share his sadness, because he feared that if he opened that door, everything would pour out uncontrollably. And so, Tim Duncan became a leader in the harshest way possible, leading by erasing himself from the emotional equation. Each passing season, that mental burden didn't lighten. It only changed shape. When the Spurs won, he had to stay humble to avoid breaking the team culture. When the Spurs lost, he had to stay calm to keep anyone from panicking. Not allowed to be sad. Not allowed to collapse. Those two unspoken commands followed him like a shadow. That was a prolonged tragedy without a clear climax, because it didn't explode in a single moment. It gnawed at him day by day. Tim Duncan was strong before the world, but the price of that strength was that he gradually became a stranger to himself. There were nights, after the locker room had emptied, when he sat alone not to seek comfort, but just to make sure he still had enough strength to continue tomorrow. He didn't allow himself to think about stopping, because stopping meant facing all the emotions that had been suppressed for so many years. And so he kept stepping onto the court with a calm face, kept shouldering the leadership role like a duty with no days off. To many people, Tim Duncan was the model of admirable composure. To himself, it was a state of existence maintained by sheer will, not by peace. The tragedy of that leader wasn't that he had to sacrifice for the collective he was used to that, but that he was never allowed to admit the sacrifice was breaking him from the inside. And in that quiet breaking, Tim Duncan still stood firm not because he felt no pain, but because he believed that if he fell, everything he had built, everyone who had leaned on him, would fall with him. After many years shouldering the role of emotional cornerstone, Tim Duncan stepped into a paradox that very few legends ever experience. The greater he became, the more invisible he grew. In an NBA era that worshipped the spotlight, where dunks were packaged into icons and personality was turned into brand, Tim Duncan chose to stand outside it all. He didn't chase media, didn't build an image, didn't join flashy ad campaigns, didn't turn himself into the face of any lifestyle beyond quiet discipline. While his contemporaries appeared on magazine covers, in advertising campaigns, and in carefully spun behind-the-scenes stories, Tim Duncan disappeared right after the final buzzer, returning to the locker room, returning to his familiar silence, not because he scorned the spotlight, but because he never believed the spotlight could bring anything truly real. In his world, existence didn't need to be proven through attention. It needed to be confirmed through doing the right thing every single day. But that very choice made him win in invisibility, becoming an uncomfortable paradox for pop culture. How do you celebrate a man who doesn't want to be seen? Tim Duncan dominated games through things that weren't easy to clip into viral videos. A perfect positional stand, a perfectly timed pass, a defensive decision so precise it made no noise. He didn't create moments for the crowd to scream. He created stability for the team to endure. And in a culture accustomed to measuring greatness by fame, that stability became hard to recognize. People remembered other names, bigger personalities, easier stories to tell, while Tim Duncan quietly accumulated wins without leaving any clear, iconic imprint beyond numbers and trophies. No ads, no shocking statements, no building of hero or villain personas. He left the public puzzled. They knew he was great, but they didn't know how to feel about him. Tim Duncan's victories didn't come with external understanding. People respected him, but rarely truly understood who he was, how he lived, what he carried inside. That invisibility wasn't accidental. It was the result of a lifetime too accustomed to self-reliance. From his mother's death, from dreams taken away, from a leadership role that allowed no vulnerability, Tim Duncan learned to shrink inward, never granting the world access to the deepest parts of himself. And when the world responded with relative indifference, he didn't resist. He accepted it as natural. But the price of that invisibility was prolonged loneliness, because winning without being understood is like a voice echoing in an empty room. Tim Duncan walked through seasons with title after title, but his story never became legend in an easy-to-tell way. No public icon to latch onto, no defining moment etched in collective memory, only a long chain of things done the right way. To the Spurs, he was the foundation. To his teammates, he was the anchor. But to the wider public, he was a faint presence amid brighter stars. And in that faintness, Tim Duncan's tragedy became clear. He won, but those wins never brought the feeling of being seen. He was acknowledged through stats and history, but rarely through emotional understanding. Invisibility didn't weaken him on the court, but it made his life off the court lonelier, because no one knew what to ask him, how to listen to him. Tim Duncan accepted it the way he accepted everything else. No complaints, no demands, no attempts to change it. But deep inside, that silence accumulated into a familiar emptiness, where he understood that he had traded being understood for stability, traded the spotlight for long-term survival. Greatness in invisibility is a rare form of victory, but it's also a prolonged form of solitude, where the winner walks on without a crowd following, without chants of his name, only the echo of his own footsteps in a journey. Very few have the patience to watch all the way through. When Tim Duncan's career moved past its peak years, his most dangerous enemy was no longer younger, faster opponents, but his own body, a body that had been used relentlessly, disciplined to the point of cruelty, and never once asked if it could handle it. There was no horrific accident that changed everything in an instant, no fall that made the whole world hold its breath. Instead, it was a slow, quiet, irreversible process of destruction. Tim's knees began to degenerate, in the way only high-intensity athletes who've played for many years truly understand. Each morning getting out of bed became a little harder. Each change of direction on the court required an extra moment to make sure the joint still obeyed. His lower back ached persistently, not intense enough to force long-term absence, but constant enough to remind him that no movement came for free. Tim Duncan didn't talk about those pains, because in the world he lived in, pain wasn't something to share. It was something to manage. He learned to play through pain as part of the job, adjusting every stride, every jump, every contest, for maximum efficiency at the lowest possible cost to his body. The change didn't happen in one season. It stretched over many years, to the point that even he couldn't clearly remember the last time he felt completely healthy. The most terrifying thing about this slow destruction is that it doesn't let you mentally prepare for the end. It just makes you gradually accustomed to enduring, until enduring becomes the normal state. Tim Duncan kept stepping onto the court, kept serving as the cornerstone, because he didn't know any other way to exist. Each time he entered the locker room, he didn't ask whether he was in pain. He asked whether he could still fulfill the role assigned to him. The pain was hidden under tape, under meticulous warm-up routines, under the familiar silence of a man who had never allowed himself to complain. Younger teammates looked at him as the model of professionalism, unaware that that professionalism was built on a foundation of long, sleepless nights, when his back hurt so much that every position became uncomfortable. In some games, Tim Duncan stepped onto the floor with a body that hadn't fully recovered, knowing every collision would leave a mark, but still accepting it, because he was used to putting the team above himself. No accident, only wear and tear. No explosive tragedy, only small signs accumulating long enough to become a burden. And in that process, Tim Duncan began to recognize a new, quieter fear. The fear that his body would betray him one day, not with a dramatic collapse, but simply by no longer meeting the demands he placed on it. He wasn't afraid of pain, because pain had become a companion. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of the moment he had to admit he no longer had enough strength to carry the load. Instead of confronting that fear head-on, Tim Duncan chose to do the only thing he knew: keep playing smarter, conserving more energy, sacrificing a little more speed, a little more explosiveness, in exchange for stability. The stats were no longer as dazzling as before, but his value on the court didn't diminish, because he compensated with experience and game-reading ability. Yet each adjustment was also a reminder that time was winning. The body didn't betray him with outright refusal, but with increasingly clear limits, forcing Tim Duncan to constantly negotiate with himself. How much is enough to play? How much more sacrifice is acceptable? No one forced him to endure, but the culture he had committed to, the leadership role he had accepted, and his own nature didn't allow him to stop easily. To the public, Tim Duncan remained calm, efficient, still the foundation of the Spurs. But behind that image was a man slowly realizing that his endurance had limits, and those limits were drawing closer with every season. The slow destruction of the body didn't create memorable moments for the media, didn't bring dramatic stories, but it left the deepest mark in the mind of the person who had to live with it every day. Tim Duncan kept playing, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he had grown accustomed to treating pain as part of his identity. And in that dangerous familiarity, the tragedy became clear. A man who had spent his entire life controlling himself now had to learn to accept that some things, no matter how silent, would gradually take away what he once believed was permanent. When the body began to impose non-negotiable limits, Tim Duncan faced a choice that few legends are willing to accept: either cling to the spotlight for himself until it went out completely, or step back deliberately to keep the collective alive. He chose the second path, not in one explosive moment, but through hundreds of small, quiet decisions stretched across many seasons. Yielding the spotlight didn't happen through announcements or ceremonies. It started with taking fewer shots, declining situations that could have made his stat line look better, and placing himself in positions where others' success mattered more than having his name mentioned. Tim Duncan stepped back from his role not because he had lost ambition, but because he understood that one person's ambition could not stand higher than the survival of the entire system. When younger teammates needed space to grow, he created that space by shrinking himself, turning his greatness into an invisible foundation. That was a rare form of sacrifice at the highest level of sports, where ego is usually nurtured like fuel. Tim Duncan didn't fight his ego with words. He did it through repeated actions. Every game a little more self-erasure, so others could shine. There were nights he knew he could still carry the team, still be the center of every decision, but he didn't do it, because the price of keeping the spotlight would be his body burning out faster and the team becoming dangerously dependent. Accepting being forgotten was the hardest part of that choice, because it brought no immediate reward. People started talking about new faces, young stars, easier stories to tell, while Tim Duncan receded into the background, becoming a silent guarantee of the common order. On the stat sheet, his role might have looked humbler. In the locker room, his value was heavier than ever. He accepted that contradiction without trying to explain it to the world, because he was used to letting actions speak for themselves. The moral tragic climax of Tim Duncan's story doesn't lie in a game-winning shot or a celebrated moment of sacrifice, but in the persistent daily self-erasure, in silence, without demanding recognition. He understood that when a system lasts long enough, it gradually forgets the bricks in the foundation, even though those very bricks once bore all the initial weight. And he accepted it, because his choice wasn't about preserving personal fame, it was about extending the life of the collective. There were times, in rare moments alone, when Tim Duncan felt the quiet sadness of being forgotten while still present, but he didn't allow that sadness to turn into bitterness. He believed that if he held to his standards, if he kept doing the right thing, then justice, however late, would exist somewhere beyond the spotlight. Sacrificing himself to sustain the team isn't a romantic story. It's a chain of painful compromises with ego, with the need to be seen, with the instinct to prove worth. Tim Duncan carried out that chain of compromises the way he had endured every other pain, without complaint, without show, without seeking comfort. He erased himself so others could shine, not because he believed he was lesser, but because he understood that enduring greatness doesn't need to stand at the center. And in that very choice, the tragedy reached its moral peak. A man big enough to step back, strong enough to accept being forgotten, and loyal enough to his own values not to regret the price he paid. When Tim Duncan had grown accustomed to erasing himself on the court to keep the collective standing strong, another loss occurred off the lights. So quietly, it left almost no trace in the public eye. His marriage ended. There were no sensational headlines, no noisy courtroom battles, no prolonged property disputes or back-and-forth accusations, just a brief, cold announcement, as cold as the way Tim Duncan had lived most of his life. The divorce didn't arrive like an explosion. It came like a door closing very softly, soft enough that no one around had to pause and ask what had been lost. In his world, where discipline ranked higher than emotion and responsibility took priority over personal needs, staying silent seemed like the natural reflex. No one asked him if it hurt, if he was tired, if he regretted it, and perhaps he himself didn't know how he would answer if the question were ever asked. A marriage dying in silence is a special kind of loss, because it doesn't allow the person involved to grieve in any real sense. There was no farewell ritual, no moment permitted for vulnerability, only an emptiness that crept into the already rare times away from the court. Tim Duncan didn't talk about that divorce, didn't try to explain it, didn't blame the grueling schedule or professional pressure, even though all of those things existed. He was too used to carrying burdens, too used to enduring, to the point that losing an important relationship seemed to simply get added to the list of things that must be accepted. But that very quick acceptance hid a deeper pain, the feeling that even the most private parts of his life weren't important enough to be witnessed. When a marriage ends in silence, people easily mistake the silence for composure. But in reality, it's often the sign of a person who has exhausted their capacity to express emotion. Tim Duncan continued to appear on the court with his familiar calm demeanor, continued to fulfill his role, continued to be the anchor for his teammates, as if his personal life hadn't been disturbed at all. But in those rare empty moments, when there was no practice, no game, no system demanding that he stand firm, that silence became heavier than ever. A major loss that no one witnessed meant the pain had no witnesses, no external confirmation that it was real. Tim Duncan received no concerned questions, wasn't granted the right to grieve publicly. He simply kept walking, carrying a part of his life that had just closed without making a sound. The irony is that the very qualities that earned him respect in sports, his privacy, discipline, lack of showmanship, made his personal life even lonelier when crisis struck. No one knew how many sleepless nights he had, how many times he questioned what he could have done differently, or how quickly he accepted the breakdown just to keep the rest of his life from collapsing. A marriage dying in silence didn't create a moment for Tim Duncan to pause and heal. It only extended the chain of losses handled by compression and moving forward. And in that chain, a pattern gradually emerged. Every time he lost something important, Tim Duncan didn't scream, didn't resist. He shrank himself a little more, as if by reducing his own emotional presence, he would hurt less. But the pain didn't disappear. It only became invisible, just like he had been during so many of his greatest years. The divorce, with all its silence, became a loss with no shared memory to cling to, no public image to preserve, existing only in the inner life of a man too accustomed to carrying everything alone. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the breakup of a relationship, but the fact that no one stopped to ask whether that always strong man ever needed to be allowed to be weak, just once. 2014 came to Tim Duncan like a long winter, where his body spoke before his mind could respond. After the private losses no one witnessed, he entered that season with a cold composure, not because the pain had subsided, but because he had grown used to living in silence. Each morning began with knee pain, as a reminder that years of endurance had accumulated enough debt. His lower back tightened, reflexes slowed by half a beat, and movements that once were instinct now had to be carefully calculated. He still arrived at the gym early, still warmed up meticulously, but deep inside was an undeniable understanding. This body no longer had reserves. No accident, no fall that broke everything, only wear and tear that had reached its limit. The Spurs ran smoothly, beautifully, disciplined to the point of coldness. The ball moved faster than the human body, positions filled before gaps could appear. In that machine, Tim Duncan was no longer the main engine, but the balancing axis. He read the game through accumulated memory, through spatial awareness, through knowing when to appear and when to withdraw. He reduced his shot attempts, chose perfect positioning plays, passes just enough to keep the rhythm intact. Every choice was one more small sacrifice to an exhausted body, but he accepted it, because the survival of the collective remained the priority. There were nights he knew he could do more, but he didn't. Not from lack of courage, but from lack of strength. And lack of strength was something he never spoke aloud. As the season progressed, the signs of depletion became clearer. Practices were adjusted, recovery times lengthened, pains appeared persistently enough that he learned to live with them like living with the weather. On the court, he remained effective, remained timely, but every collision left lingering aftershocks that lasted into the night. There were moments he stood under the basket, watching younger teammates soar, and inside there was no jealousy, only quiet acceptance that his role had changed. His greatness now lay not in leading the scoring, but in keeping everything from collapsing. The playoffs arrived, intensity rose, and every game felt like a new negotiation with his body. Tim Duncan played more with memory than reflexes, more with positioning than explosiveness. He knew where to stand, so he didn't have to jump too high. Knew when to let go of a contest to save energy for the next. Knew when to cede the center to someone else. Each decision was a small cut into the ego of someone who had once been the center, but he never hesitated. He had learned to step back long ago, and now stepping back was the only way to keep going. In the locker room, he sat still, breathing evenly, eyes closed not to focus but to endure. No one asked if he was in pain, and he didn't need anyone to ask. When the Spurs advanced to the finals, memories of previous failures hovered like shadows. But this time, the team played basketball that was nearly perfect, and Tim Duncan was the silent part of that perfection. He didn't need brilliant moments. He needed stable minutes. And then, when victory came, it didn't explode inside him the way it had in his first titles. He smiled, hugged teammates, received the final trophy with a composure forged over many years. In that moment, joy arrived quickly, then receded, leaving a hard-to-name emptiness. This victory didn't fill anything. It closed something. At the celebration, he blended into the group. Lights swept over, cheers rose high, but Tim Duncan didn't seek confirmation. He felt clearly that his body had given everything. Every step after that night felt heavier. Every morning waking carried a silent question about limits. He wasn't afraid of pain. He was afraid of having to admit he no longer had enough ability to keep paying the price with his body. And that very admission gave the final victory the taste of an ending. Sweet but bland, complete but sad. There was no announcement moment, no promises, only quiet understanding that a chapter had closed. Tim Duncan felt no regret, because he had walked the entire path with absolute loyalty to his values. But in that loyalty, there was an unavoidable ache. The price of endurance is depletion. The price of sacrifice is the final emptiness. The final victory didn't come to save him. It came to allow him to stop. And when the lights went out, what remained wasn't the cheers, but the silence of a man who had given too much, standing at the edge of letting go, knowing the body was spent, and the right thing now was not to try anymore. After the final championship, Tim Duncan didn't stand at a crossroads lit by spotlights or pleas to stay. He stood before a door left slightly ajar, and he stepped through it alone. Retirement didn't come as an event, but as a decision that had been quietly nurtured for too long in silence. No farewell tour, no series of tribute games, no long tribute videos to make the crowd rise for one last ovation. Tim Duncan didn't want that, and no one truly tried to hold him back. He didn't announce it with a choked voice, didn't let public tears become the explanation for an entire career. He simply left, quietly, the same way he had lived most of his life on the court. The day his retirement was confirmed, the world's reaction wasn't loud, not because he wasn't great enough, but because he had never taught the world how to remember him. People respected the decision, nodded, and quickly moved on to the next story. New stars emerged, new seasons began, and the machine kept turning without waiting for anyone. Tim Duncan watched it all from a distance, without bitterness, without resentment. He was used to not being held back. Even in the moment that should have been preserved the most, he didn't become the center of attention. A legend vanished as if he had never existed, not because history forgot him, but because the present didn't know what to do with a man who had never needed to be celebrated. There was no final game for the crowd to rise in tribute, no moment of him leaving the court to prolonged applause. Tim Duncan's ending unfolded in everyday life. One morning, waking up with no practice schedule, no game schedule, no demand to keep his body in a state of readiness, that silence was both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because his body was no longer dragged beyond its limits. Terrifying because for the first time, in more than 2 decades, no structure defined who he was. He had lived his entire life in discipline, in roles, in responsibility, and now, as all of it withdrew, the unspoken question took shape clearly. If he was no longer Tim Duncan of the Spurs, who was he? No one holding him back also meant no one requiring him to continue. The younger teammates had grown up. The system ran on its own. The team could move forward. That was his greatest success, but also his deepest emptiness. He had done so well that he had become unnecessary. And in a world that worships irreplaceability, being replaced smoothly is a heartbreaking paradox. Tim Duncan didn't fight that paradox. He accepted it the way he had accepted every previous loss. He didn't need anyone to convince him to stay, because his body and mind had been saying long enough that it was time to stop. His departure didn't leave a noisy void. It left an absence that's hard to name. The Spurs kept playing, the stands stayed full, the season continued, but something was no longer present. A quiet standard, an unspoken anchor. Tim Duncan faded from the spotlight, and he didn't try to return. He didn't join commentary, didn't appear frequently in the media, didn't recount his story through emotional memoirs. He let his career rest, like an object that had fulfilled its function, no longer needing to be displayed. In the early days of retirement, Tim Duncan experienced a very different kind of loneliness. The loneliness of someone no longer needed. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of a mission completed. No one called to ask about strategy. No one expected him to fix mistakes on the court. No one needed him to step up and shoulder responsibility. That silence was both a reward and a wound. It gave him time, but it also forced him to confront the emptiness he had filled his entire life with work and endurance. A legend vanishing as if he had never existed doesn't mean he left no trace. Tim Duncan's trace lies in the way the Spurs operate, in the way young players learn to put the team above self, in the composure before victory and defeat. But those traces don't carry his name, aren't tied to his face on posters. And he accepted that, because he had never lived to be credited. He lived to do things right. Looking back, there was no retirement moment for the crowd to cry with him, but there is a quieter truth. Tim Duncan left exactly the way he arrived, without noise, without demands, without leaving a message. He left on his own, because that was the only right he kept for himself after a lifetime of giving everything away. And in that departure, there is an indescribable ache. The world keeps turning, while a man who once carried an entire system now steps to the sidelines. No one holding him, no one pulling him back, as if his quiet presence had never been something indispensable. After the day he voluntarily stepped away from the biggest stage of his life, Tim Duncan entered a state of existence that he had known from very early on, but thought he had left behind. Loneliness in its most original form. There were no more cheers echoing down from the stands, no more titles for others to call him by before calling the man behind them, no more legend, no more pillar, no more quiet leader. All the layers that had once wrapped around his life fell away very quickly, leaving a stripped bare human standing before an emptiness that no one had prepared him to face. Tim Duncan woke up in mornings with no schedule, no pressure, no obligations, but also no clear purpose to get out of bed. That quiet was not peaceful in appearance. It was like an empty room that had once been full of voices, now echoing only memories. Loneliness returned not noisily, not fiercely, but quietly like an old acquaintance. It didn't ask if he missed it. It simply sat down beside him, as it had done when he was 14 years old, standing in front of his mother's coffin. Tim Duncan recognized the similarity too clearly, the feeling of not being called by name, not being asked about, not being held on to. Back then, he was a child no one taught how to grieve. Now, he was a man no one taught how to live when every role had vanished. Sports had once given him a structure to exist within, a reason to endure, a framework of discipline, so he wouldn't have to confront the voids inside directly. When that structure dissolved, those voids were no longer shielded. They appeared plainly, raw, unavoidable. No cheers meant no more responses. No titles meant no more social mirror to reflect who he was. Tim Duncan stepped into everyday life and realized that very few people knew what to say to him when basketball no longer stood between them. Conversations became short, safe, never touching anything deep. He didn't blame them. He understood that his whole life had taught the world how to keep its distance. But understanding didn't mean it didn't hurt. The pain now wasn't sharp like an injury, not intense like a defeat. It was the pain of prolonged emptiness, of no longer being needed. For a person who had lived by carrying responsibility, no longer being needed by anyone was a fall with no railing. Only pain and memories remained, and neither followed a schedule. Memories arrived suddenly. An early morning practice, the familiar sound of a ball bouncing on the floor, a moment standing silently in the locker room. At the same time came memories that were never healed. His mother, the sea that swallowed his first dream, the years of silent endurance just to survive. Tim Duncan realized he had never truly left that childhood behind. He had only built layer upon layer of responsibility on top of it, so he wouldn't have to return. Now, with everything collapsed, he stood again exactly where he had begun. Alone, silent, self-taught in how to endure. Loneliness at this stage was no longer the absence of others, but the absence of meaning. With no more games to prepare for, no team to protect, no role to fulfill, Tim Duncan had to face the question he had avoided for decades. What did he live for, beyond enduring? He had no immediate answer, and that unsettled him in a way that even the harshest finals had never managed. Because on the court, no matter how much it hurt, he always knew what to do next. Here, in life after everything, there was no playbook, no whistle to guide. Loneliness returned just like in childhood, in that it wasn't dramatic, wasn't acknowledged, wasn't witnessed by anyone. It simply existed, persistent, enduring. Tim Duncan didn't try to escape it through media or fake busyness. He was too tired to build more layers of cover. He let himself stay in that loneliness as a truth that needed to be accepted. Some days he felt lighter, some days so heavy he only wanted to curl up, but he didn't call that failure. He understood that this was the part even a great career couldn't save, the human part behind all the titles. No cheers, no titles, only pain and memories that wasn't a tragic ending in a loud way. It was a return to the essence of Tim Duncan before the world knew him. A silent man, self-enduring, learning to exist without needing to be seen. And in that return, there was a very real ache. Every final circle closes at the starting point. After all he had achieved, after every sacrifice and victory, loneliness was not defeated. It only stepped back, waited until everything else left, then stepped forward again, familiar as a part of his flesh and blood that he had never had the chance to shake off. There is no salvation waiting for Tim Duncan at the end of this road. There is no bright moment where all wounds are soothed, no affirmation that everything he has endured will finally be repaid with peace. His life does not close with complete healing, much less with a symbolic final victory. It closes with a far harsher truth. There are people who live rightly, but the price they pay is carrying those cracks until the very end. Tim Duncan is such a person. After everything, what remains is not the legend, not the trophies or the statistics, but an American man who has endured too long and has never betrayed himself. He lived rightly in his own way, even though that way was never comfortable. From the moment he was 14 years old, standing in front of his mother's coffin, Tim Duncan learned a lesson no child should have to learn so early. The world does not stop to wait for you to grieve. He swallowed his tears, not because he was strong, but because there was no other choice. Silence became a survival instinct, and that instinct followed him throughout his entire life. When his swimming dream was swallowed by the sea, when basketball came late and no one waited, when he entered the NBA without the aura of genius, he did not complain. He simply kept enduring, kept working, kept believing that if he lived right enough, the world would eventually allow him to exist. Throughout his career, Tim Duncan did not seek affection. He did not build an image, did not demand the spotlight, did not bargain with the media. He accepted staying in the shadows if it helped the team stand firm. He gave up the spotlight, stepped back from roles, erased himself so others could shine, not because he lacked ambition, but because he believed responsibility was greater than self. But every time he stepped back was a trade-off, not just of fame, but of his own emotional presence. He learned not to be weak, not to be sad, not to collapse, even when inside he was already cracked. And so, his greatness was built on a foundation of prolonged sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that brings no relief, only the ability to continue. His body betrayed him not through accidents, but through slow, ruthless wear and tear. Degenerating knees, chronic back pain, the aches became routine. He played through pain the way others play through opponents, without letting anyone see, without making anyone worry. Even when he won that final championship, his body was depleted, and the joy was not complete. Victory tasted like an ending, not like liberation. And when he retired, he was not held back. No farewell tour, no public tears. He left on his own, quietly the way he had arrived, leaving a void that only those who truly understood could feel. After everything, loneliness returned in its original form. No titles, no cheers, only pain and memories. Tim Duncan stood in a place very much like his childhood, alone, silent, facing what had never been healed. He did not try to rewrite the story in a more comfortable direction. He did not demand that the world look back, apologize, or give more tribute. He accepted that some lives do not close with consolation. Some people walk the entire road without ever receiving the promise that everything will be okay. And it is here that silent tribute becomes necessary, not to turn Tim Duncan into a perfect icon, but to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. He paid enough for the way he lived. He paid with a childhood without embraces, with dreams taken away, with a worn-down body, with a personal life that fell apart in silence, with the final years learning to exist without a role. He was not saved, not fully healed, not given a final emotional victory, but he also did not betray himself. He did not trade for comfort by living wrong. He did not sell out his values for temporary consolation. Tim Duncan lived rightly, and that is exactly what makes his story both tragic and worthy of respect. In a world that worships cheers and happy endings, he reminds us that some great lives do not end in joy, but in painful honesty. That some people are not embraced by history with warm arms, but history stands firm because of them. He does not need to be called a hero. He only needs to be understood correctly. An American man who endured too long, carried too much, and did not betray himself, even though the price was carrying wounds until the very end. That is the absolute tragic ending of Tim Duncan. No miracle, no salvation, only the truth. And in that truth, there is a quiet tribute that no applause can replace. He lived rightly, even though he had to pay the full price. The story of Tim Duncan leaves a deep and quiet sadness, not because he failed, but because he won too much in silence. From the detail of the 14-year-old boy standing in front of his mother's coffin with no one to teach him how to cry, to the grown man accustomed to swallowing pain instead of expressing it, this story shows a life built on endurance rather than healing. Tim Duncan did not enter the NBA with the aura of genius, without a media campaign, without a public persona. He only had discipline, responsibility, and absolute loyalty to the team. That is what makes the victories in 1999 or 2014, though glorious on the record books, feel empty in his inner life. Especially the detail of his body being slowly worn down, degenerating knees, chronic back pain shows the real price of American resilience. No tragic accident, just silent destruction over the years. The marriage that ended without dispute, without noise, only highlights another tragedy. When a man is used to carrying everything for others, when it comes to his own private losses, no one asks if he is hurting. The retirement without a farewell tour, without clinging, shows that Tim Duncan did so well he became unnecessary, a bitter paradox. From there, the lesson for Americans is not in blindly praising sacrifice, but in balance. Work hard, live responsibly, but do not let yourself disappear in your own life. Tim Duncan's story reminds us that success does not automatically bring peace. Peace needs to be cared for like health and relationships. Honoring him is honoring integrity and steadfastness, while also serving as a warning for each person to know when to stop, to listen to themselves before having to pay the full price, like he did. If the story of Tim Duncan makes you go quiet and look back at yourself, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring great lives that lived rightly but paid a very high price. Thank you for listening in silence, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor those who do not need the spotlight to become great.